Most people think gas stations are some of the safest places to stop late at night. Bright lights, security cameras, a cashier just a few feet away. It feels like nothing truly terrifying could happen there. Until it does. Tonight, you are about to hear 3 real encounters that turned ordinary gas stations into absolute nightmares. One man walked into work expecting another boring overnight shift. Instead, a customer covered in blood smiled at him and calmly said, "Don't worry, it is not my blood." Minutes later, he was fighting for his life. Another witness spent weeks wondering if he'd escaped something horrific, only to realize someone had been silently stalking him, learning where he lived and sending a message that made him abandon his job and leave town entirely. And finally, after stopping for what should have been a harmless nap during a late-night drive, one exhausted worker unknowingly carried a stranger hidden in the bed of his truck for miles down an empty highway, until that stranger tried to break his way inside while the truck was moving at full speed. These stories aren't about ghosts or monsters. They're about real people, real places, and the terrifying realization that sometimes the scariest thing you'll ever meet is another human being. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's get into tonight's stories. Most overnight shifts at that gas station felt exactly the same. The hours blended together until it was impossible to tell whether it was 1 o'clock in the morning or 4. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly overhead, the coffee sat on the warmer for far too long, and every few minutes I glanced through the front windows hoping to see headlights pulling into the parking lot just to break the boredom. My name's David, and years ago I worked the overnight shift at a tiny gas station and convenience store sitting in the middle of nowhere. This was long before every business had high-definition cameras covering every inch of the property. Security cameras existed, sure, but the owner didn't exactly believe in spending money unless he absolutely had to. To be honest, he was the biggest headache about the job. The guy somehow managed to forget the exact same conversations we'd have every single week. We'd argue over something, settle it, and then 2 days later he'd bring up the exact issue like we'd never talked about it before. It was frustrating, but compared to everything else, the job was unbelievably easy. From 11 at night until 7 in the morning, I was usually the only employee in the building. Most nights only a handful of customers stopped by. Hours could pass without anyone walking through the door, leaving me leaning against the counter flipping through magazines just to keep myself awake. That particular night felt no different. The store was completely silent except for the soft electrical buzz from the old fluorescent lights. After hearing that sound every night for months, my brain barely registered it anymore. Then, ding, the front door opened. The sudden chime nearly made me jump. I looked up expecting another tired traveler grabbing coffee or maybe a truck driver looking for cigarettes. Instead, I saw a man I'd never forget for the rest of my life. He looked to be somewhere in his 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, and athletic enough that my first thought was maybe he'd played professional sports at some point. But then my eyes adjusted. His clothes, his face, his arms. They were covered in blood, not a few drops, not a small stain, an unbelievable amount. There was a massive splash across the front of his shirt, streaks running down both arms and dried smears across his face. It was so much blood that my brain actually refused to accept what I was seeing at first. It almost looked fake, like something from a movie set. For several seconds, I couldn't move. My mind kept trying to come up with some normal explanation. Maybe it was paint. Maybe there'd been an accident. Maybe I wasn't seeing things correctly. But deep down I already knew that wasn't paint. What made the whole thing even worse wasn't the blood. It was his face. His eyes were completely empty. There wasn't panic. There wasn't fear. There wasn't even excitement. He looked like a man stopping for snacks after work, calm, relaxed, almost bored. It was as if he had absolutely no idea he was drenched in what looked like someone else's blood. I couldn't stop staring. Every time I forced myself to look away, my eyes immediately drifted right back to him. Of course he noticed. Anyone would have. Then something happened that completely short-circuited my brain. He smiled. Not a creepy horror movie grin. Just a casual, friendly smile. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, "Don't worry, it is not my blood." My stomach dropped. If anything, that sentence made everything 1,000 times worse. Because if it wasn't his blood, whose was it? Every survival instinct inside me went into overdrive. One thought kept repeating in my head. This guy may have just killed someone, and another thought followed right behind it. I might be next. Still, I knew showing fear would probably be the worst thing I could do. So somehow, despite my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe, I forced myself to nod like he'd just made some harmless joke about the weather. Then I lowered my eyes back to the magazine, pretending to read while secretly watching him move through the store from the corner of my vision. He wandered through the aisles with unbelievable confidence. casually grabbing a few random items as though this were the most ordinary shopping trip of his life. Honestly, I expected him to rob the place. If he'd emptied the register, I probably would have handed him every dollar without saying a word. Instead, he calmly walked up to the counter with his purchases, and somehow, the night was about to become even more terrifying. I did everything I could to keep my hands from shaking as I rang up his items. I never looked directly into his eyes again. I was terrified that if I made eye contact, something would snap inside him. So I focused on the cash register, scanned the items one by one, and acted like this was just another routine transaction in the middle of another boring overnight shift. The entire time I could feel him standing there, waiting. Watching the silence between us felt unbearable. Finally, the register displayed the total. Without saying another word, he reached into his pocket, paid in cash, grabbed the bag, turned around, and walked out the front door. Ding, the door closed behind him. For a second, I just stood there, completely frozen. I didn't move until I heard the distant sound of a car engine starting somewhere outside in the parking lot. That sound finally broke the spell. I lunged for the phone behind the counter and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. I explained everything as clearly as I could. I told them a man had just walked into the store covered in blood. I described his height, his build, his clothes, and every detail I could remember. I admitted I had no idea what had actually happened, but I was convinced something was terribly wrong. The dispatcher began asking follow-up questions. Did he threaten you? Was anyone else with him? Did you see what kind of vehicle he left in? I answered as quickly as I could, trying not to lose my train of thought. Then, right in the middle of one of my answers, ding, the front door opened again. I barely glanced toward it. My first thought was that another customer had walked in at the worst possible moment. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was him. The same man. The blood-covered customer had come back. Except this time the calm expression was gone. His face was twisted with anger. His eyes, which had seemed almost lifeless only minutes earlier, were now burning with rage. Every muscle in my body locked up. My heart dropped into my stomach. I instantly slammed the phone onto the counter, hoping he hadn't noticed who I was talking to. But I was already too late. He'd seen me through the front window. He knew exactly what I'd done. He marched straight toward the counter with long, aggressive strides. The moment he reached me, he exploded. "Did you call the cops?" His voice echoed through the empty store. I shook my head immediately. "Number," it came out almost as a whisper. "I didn't." He stared at me for a second, then his expression hardened even more. "Don't lie to me." His voice was louder now. "I know you called them." I kept denying it. I didn't know what else to do. "Number, I didn't." He wasn't buying a single word. The shouting got louder. He cursed at me, accusing me of sticking my nose where it didn't belong. He kept repeating that I should have minded my own business. I slowly raised both hands in front of me, trying to show I wasn't looking for a fight. I barely spoke. Everything in my body was telling me that saying the wrong thing could make this much worse. Unfortunately, it didn't matter. The anger in his face kept building. His breathing got heavier. His jaw clenched. For one terrifying second, everything became strangely quiet. Then, without any warning whatsoever, he launched himself over the counter. Not climbed, not leaned. He literally threw his entire body across it before I could even react. He crashed into me like a linebacker, driving both of us hard onto the floor. 1 second I was standing behind the register. The next I was fighting for my life beneath a man who was trying to kill me. The impact knocked the air right out of my lungs. For a split second, everything went blurry. Before I could even process what had happened, his hands were around my throat. He wasn't trying to scare me. He wasn't trying to rough me up. He was squeezing as hard as he could. I immediately realized this wasn't some angry customer throwing a punch. This man was trying to kill me. I'd never been in a real fight before that night. I'd never been tackled. I'd never been choked. And suddenly I found myself lying on the filthy convenience store floor, desperately trying to breathe while a complete stranger crushed my neck with both hands. Pure panic took over. Every instinct became focused on one thing: survive. I kicked wildly, hoping to knock him off balance. I clawed at his arms. I scratched his face. At one point, I even bit him. Nothing seemed to work. He barely reacted. He just kept coming at me with this terrifying intensity, throwing punches whenever his grip loosened for even a second before grabbing my throat again. The two of us rolled across the floor behind the counter, knocking over displays and sending candy bars, magazines, and small items flying in every direction. The entire time, I could feel the sticky blood covering his clothes rubbing off onto me. It smeared across my shirt, across my hands. Across my hands. I didn't even know whose blood it was. That thought alone made me feel sick. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My vision started narrowing. Every breath became harder to pull in. I honestly believed those were going to be the last moments of my life. Then something happened. Not because I had a plan, but because I was completely out of options. I shouted the first thing that came into my head. I have a gun. The words exploded out of my mouth. I'm not afraid to use it. It was a total lie. There wasn't a firearm anywhere in that store. I'd never even owned one. I just hoped the threat would make him hesitate. For one incredibly long second, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. The rage disappeared just enough for uncertainty to creep in. His eyes darted around the counter. Maybe he was looking for the weapon. Maybe he believed I had one hidden nearby. Whatever went through his mind, it worked. He released me. He scrambled backwards so fast it almost looked like he'd been burned. Without another word, he jumped to his feet, sprinted toward the entrance, shoved the door open, and disappeared into the darkness. A second later, I heard tires screech across the parking lot. His car accelerated away at full speed. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. I stayed exactly where I was, flat on my back, gasping for air. My entire body hurt. My neck burned. My chest felt like it had been crushed. I was covered in a horrifying mixture of my own blood and someone else's. For several minutes, I couldn't even convince myself to stand. Eventually, flashing red and blue lights reflected through the front windows. The police had arrived. When the officers rushed inside and saw the condition I was in, they didn't waste any time. After making sure I was alive, they immediately began searching for the man who had attacked me. I gave them every detail I could remember: his appearance, his clothes, his voice, everything. But despite everything that had happened, I never heard another word about the case. No detective ever contacted me. No arrest was announced. I never saw a news report that matched what I'd experienced. It was like the man had simply vanished. For years afterward, I kept wondering the same question. If that wasn't his blood, whose blood was it? I never found out. And as terrifying as that attack was, I had no idea that a few months later, another complete stranger would walk into that same gas station, carrying a photograph that would drag me right back into the nightmare I thought I'd escaped. After everything that happened that night, you'd think I would have quit on the spot. Honestly, looking back, I probably should have. But life doesn't always give you the luxury of walking away. Bills still had to be paid. Rent was still due every month. So despite nearly being strangled to death by a man covered in blood, I kept showing up for my overnight shifts at the same lonely gas station. Over time, I convinced myself it had just been a freak incident, a once-in-a-lifetime nightmare. The kind of story you tell people years later because something that insane could never happen twice. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few months passed without anything unusual happening. Night after night, everything went back to normal. The endless silence, the humming fluorescent lights, the occasional customer grabbing coffee or snacks before disappearing back onto the highway. Little by little, I stopped expecting danger every time the front door opened. Then one night, the chime rang again. A man walked inside. At first glance, there wasn't anything obviously threatening about him. In fact, he looked completely out of place for a totally different reason. He was wearing an expensive suit, not just a decent suit. A perfectly tailored dark gray suit that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom, not inside a tiny gas station in the middle of nowhere after midnight. Everything about him looked polished. His shoes were spotless. His hair was neatly styled. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being taken seriously. For a second, I figured maybe he just left a wedding or some high-end business event. It was strange, but not terrifying. At least not yet. What immediately caught my attention was what he didn't do. He never looked toward the coolers. He didn't browse the snack aisle. He didn't glance at the coffee station. He walked straight toward the counter as if he'd entered the store with one specific purpose. Then he stopped directly in front of me. He didn't greet me, didn't smile, didn't even make eye contact. Instead, he slowly reached inside his jacket. My pulse instantly spiked. For one horrifying second, I thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, he removed a photograph. Without saying a word, he placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. Confused, I looked down. The second my eyes focused on the picture, every bit of color drained from my face. It was him, the blood-covered man. The same man who had smiled at me, the same man who'd calmly said it wasn't his blood, the same man who had jumped over the counter and tried to strangle me to death. The photograph wasn't perfect. It looked like it had been taken from a distance. Still, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind. It was the same person. My heart immediately started racing again. I tried to hide my reaction, I really did. But I could already tell I'd failed. I couldn't stop staring at the photograph. It was like my brain had frozen. I could feel the suited man watching every tiny expression on my face. The silence stretched on. Neither of us said a word. Finally, I looked up. He was already staring directly at me. His eyes were cold, sharp, calculating. He wasn't looking at me like a customer. He was studying me, almost as if he were trying to decide whether I was lying before I'd even spoken. The silence became almost unbearable. Then, after what felt like forever, he finally spoke. His voice surprised me. It was rough, deep, like someone who had spent years smoking cigarettes. He asked one simple question. Have you ever seen this man before? My stomach tightened. Every instinct inside me screamed the exact same answer. Number. I didn't hesitate. I shook my head. Number. I've never seen him. Even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure why I'd lied. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I didn't trust him. Maybe I simply refused to get pulled back into whatever nightmare that photograph represented. Whatever the reason, I knew one thing for certain. There was no way I was telling this stranger the truth. What I didn't realize was that he already seemed to know exactly what my answer would be. The man didn't react to my answer, not right away. He just stood there completely still, staring at me with those cold, unreadable eyes. It wasn't the kind of stare you get from someone who is simply skeptical. It felt calculated, like he was taking apart every word I'd said, every expression on my face, every tiny movement I made. The silence became almost unbearable. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Does he know? Did I give myself away? Who is this guy? I kept telling myself to stay calm. If I changed my story now, it would only make things worse, so I held my ground. I've never seen him. For another few seconds, he didn't say a word. Then, without any change in his expression, he slowly reached down and picked up the photograph. I watched him tuck it back into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Finally, it looked like the conversation was over. He turned around and began walking toward the front door. I let out the biggest sigh of relief I'd taken all night. I honestly thought I'd gotten away with it. I watched him cross the store, each step bringing him closer to the exit. He reached for the door. Then, he stopped. Without opening it, he slowly turned back toward me one last time. Our eyes met across the store. His face hadn't changed. Neither had his voice. It was calm, almost emotionless. Then he said 5 words that sent a chill through my entire body. I know you are lying. That was it. No yelling, no threats. No explanation. He simply opened the door, walked outside, and disappeared into the darkness. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I just stood behind the counter, staring at the closed door. The entire encounter had lasted only a couple of minutes, but it left me more shaken than I wanted to admit. Questions started flooding my mind. Who was he? How did he know about the man who attacked me? Why was he carrying that photograph? Was he a detective? A private investigator? Someone from law enforcement? If he was, why hadn't he identified himself? Why all the secrecy? Then another possibility crossed my mind. One that was far more terrifying. What if he wasn't trying to find the blood-covered man? What if he worked with him? The thought made my stomach turn. It suddenly felt like I'd stumbled into something much bigger than one violent encounter at a gas station. If these people were connected, then maybe the attack on me hadn't been random at all. I considered calling the police. My hand even hovered over the phone for a moment. But the memory of what happened the last time I called 911 came rushing back. The blood-covered man had somehow noticed. He'd stormed back into the store, and I'd nearly died because of it. That memory was enough to stop me. Even if this strange man had frightened me, I had no idea what crime I was supposed to report. A guy walked into the store, showed me a photograph, asked a question, then left. It sounded ridiculous. So I convinced myself to let it go. Maybe it was over. Maybe I'd never see him again. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. The silence slowly lulled me into believing I'd worried for nothing. But sometimes, the most dangerous people don't strike right away. Sometimes, they wait. And before long, I began noticing something that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing all over again. A silver SUV. At first, it appeared outside the gas station. Then somewhere else. Then somewhere it had absolutely no business being. That is when I realized this nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. After everything I'd already been through, it would have been easy to become paranoid. I didn't want to be the kind of person who saw danger everywhere. I kept trying to convince myself there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Then I saw the silver SUV again. The first few times it was parked across the street from the gas station during one of my daytime shifts. That alone wasn't enough to make me panic. Cars come and go all the time, and there wasn't anything illegal about someone sitting in a parking lot. So I ignored it. A couple of days later, I stopped at the grocery store after work. As I pushed my cart toward my car, something caught my eye. That same silver SUV, same color, same shape, parked only a few rows away. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Maybe it wasn't the same vehicle. Silver SUVs aren't exactly rare. That had to be it. Just a coincidence. I loaded my groceries, drove home, and tried not to think about it anymore. But the coincidences kept piling up. A few days later, I glanced out my window while pulling onto my street. There it was again, the same SUV, parked where it had absolutely no reason to be. That is when the uneasy feeling I'd been trying so hard to ignore turned into genuine fear. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions. I've never considered myself paranoid. But when the same vehicle keeps appearing in completely different places over the course of 2 weeks, your mind starts asking questions whether you want it to or not. And deep down, I already believed I knew who was behind the wheel, the man in the expensive suit. I couldn't prove it. I never got close enough to see the driver, but every instinct I had told me it was him. The realization that terrified me most wasn't that someone might be following me. It was something much worse. How did he know where I lived? I'd never told him my name. I'd never given him my address. I'd barely spoken to him. Yet somehow, he'd found me. I promised myself that if I saw the SUV one more time, I'd quietly call the police. Not from work. Not where anyone could see me. I'd report everything as carefully as possible, but I kept putting it off. Part of me hoped the problem would simply disappear if I ignored it. Looking back, that was probably the biggest mistake I made. I lived alone back then. There wasn't anyone waiting for me at home. No roommates, no family, nobody checking in every night. If something happened, I'd be completely on my own. Still, life went on. Days turned into weeks. The SUV appeared less often, and eventually I stopped seeing it altogether. For a brief moment, I actually believed I'd been right. Maybe whoever it was had finally lost interest. Maybe the nightmare was over. Then, roughly 3 weeks after that mysterious man had walked into the gas station, I was ripped awake in the middle of the night by the sound of shattering glass. The noise was so violent that I was fully awake before I even understood what had happened. Adrenaline instantly flooded my body. Without thinking, I reached beneath my bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept there for protection. I rushed into the living room, expecting to come face to face with an intruder. Instead, the house was completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. My heart pounded as I searched every room. It didn't take long. The place was small. Whoever had made that noise was already gone. Then I looked down. Right in the middle of my living room floor, surrounded by broken glass from the shattered window, was a single rock about the size of a fist. No note, no message, no explanation. Just a rock. But somehow, it said everything it needed to. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at that rock. It was so ordinary. Just a plain chunk of stone sitting in the middle of my living room, surrounded by broken glass. But it felt like the loudest threat I'd ever received. There wasn't a note attached to it. No message, no demands, nothing written at all. Whoever had thrown it didn't need words. The message was crystal clear. I know where you live. A chill ran through my entire body. Every uneasy feeling I'd tried to ignore over the previous few weeks suddenly came crashing back. The silver SUV. The man in the expensive suit. The photograph. His final words. I know you are lying. None of it had been a coincidence. Someone had been watching me, someone had followed me home. And now they'd made sure I knew it. I walked through the house one more time with the baseball bat still in my hands, checking every room, every closet, and every corner, even though I already knew nobody was inside. It wasn't really about finding someone anymore. I just needed to convince myself that I was alone. Eventually, I lowered the bat and sat on the edge of my couch, staring at the broken window. Sleep wasn't happening that night. Neither was pretending everything was fine. For weeks, I'd kept telling myself things would blow over if I ignored them. That strategy had officially failed. The next morning, I made one of the easiest decisions of my life. I quit. No 2-week notice. No long explanation. I simply walked away from the gas station. Whatever was happening, I wanted no part of it anymore. At the same time, I started looking for somewhere else to live. It wasn't easy. Finding an affordable apartment took more than a month, and every day during that search, I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Every unfamiliar car caught my attention. Every stranger made me wonder if they were watching me. I hated living like that. Eventually, I found a small apartment a few towns away. Nothing fancy, just an ordinary place where I hoped nobody knew who I was. The move felt like hitting a reset button after I left my old neighborhood. Something changed. The silver SUV disappeared. I never saw it again. No more strange encounters. No more photographs. No more late-night surprises. For the first time in months, I could finally breathe. Not long after that, I found another job. Life slowly settled back into something that almost felt normal. Then, less than a year later, I decided to move again. This time, I didn't just change towns. I moved completely out of state. I wanted as much distance as possible between myself and everything that had happened. Thankfully, that seemed to be the end of it. Years have passed since those nights. I've built a different life, but every now and then, my mind drifts back to those experiences. Oddly enough, it isn't the violent attack that haunts me the most. As terrifying as that fight was, at least I understood what was happening. Someone was trying to hurt me. The second incident is what still keeps me guessing. Why would someone spend weeks following me? Why track me from place to place? Why throw a rock through my window instead of simply confronting me? The only explanation I've ever been able to come up with is that the man in the suit believed I had some connection to the blood-covered customer. Maybe he thought I knew where he was hiding. Maybe he thought I was protecting him. Maybe he believed I knew something I actually didn't. The truth is, I have no idea, and after all these years, I've accepted that I probably never will. But if I thought that was the most terrifying gas station story I'd ever hear, I was wrong, because another man named Robert would experience something even more unbelievable after stopping at a lonely gas station late one night. And unlike me, his nightmare didn't begin inside the store. It began after he fell asleep in his truck. The next story comes from a man named Robert Daniel. Unlike my experiences, his nightmare didn't start with a suspicious customer or a strange conversation. It started with exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that sneaks up on you after an incredibly long day, when your body is running on fumes and your brain is begging for sleep. About 8 months before he shared his story, Robert had been working at a job site nearly 3 hours away from home. The work had been brutal. Everything had taken longer than expected, and by the time he packed up his tools and climbed into his truck, it was already after 10 o'clock at night. Normally, a 3-hour drive wouldn't have been a huge deal, but after spending an entire day doing physically demanding work, staying awake became its own battle. His truck wasn't new, either. There were no fancy driver assistance features. No lane centering, no adaptive cruise control. Nothing that could help if fatigue got the better of him. It was just him, an aging truck, and miles of dark highway. About 45 minutes into the drive, he realized he was in trouble. His eyelids kept drifting shut. Every few seconds, he'd catch himself and shake his head, trying to force himself to stay alert. He knew he couldn't keep going like that. Falling asleep behind the wheel wasn't worth the risk, so when he spotted the next gas station just off the highway, he pulled in. By then, it was close to 11 o'clock. He filled the truck with gas, stepped outside for a cigarette, and stood there debating his options. There was still more than 2 hours left before he'd make it home. Even after the cigarette, he could barely keep his eyes open. That is when he made what seemed like the smartest decision of the night. Instead of pushing through the exhaustion, he decided to sleep for a while. He drove to the far corner of the parking lot, shut off the engine, leaned his seat back, and set an alarm. Sleeping in his truck didn't bother him. He'd slept in far worse places over the years. Within moments, he was completely out. When the alarm finally woke him, it felt like only a few seconds had passed. His body still wanted more sleep, but he definitely felt better than before. Good enough to finish the drive. He stretched, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and looked around the parking lot. It was completely empty. Earlier, there had been a couple of other vehicles parked nearby. Now they were gone. The gas station itself looked quiet. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt wrong, so he started the engine, pulled back onto the highway, and continued toward home. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. The road was nearly deserted. Traffic was almost non-existent. The steady rhythm of the tires rolling across the pavement made the drive feel peaceful. His body settled into that familiar state every long-distance driver knows. Not asleep, not fully alert, just operating on habit. His hands stayed on the steering wheel while his mind wandered. Then, something interrupted the silence. A faint thump. At first, he barely noticed it. A few minutes later, it happened again. Thump. He turned the air conditioning down so he could listen more carefully. The sound was definitely coming from somewhere behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. The back seat looked exactly the way he'd left it. No loose tools, no boxes sliding around, no obvious explanation. He figured something in the truck bed must have shifted during the drive. Maybe one of his tools had tipped over. It wasn't unusual enough to justify pulling onto the shoulder. So he kept driving, but the sound didn't stop. If anything, it became more frequent, and before long, what had started as a minor annoyance was about to become something far, far worse. The thumping kept happening. Not constantly. Just often enough to get under Robert's skin. Every few minutes. Thump. Then silence. A little later. Thump. The sound wasn't loud enough to suggest something was seriously wrong with the truck, but it was impossible to ignore. The more he listened to it, the more irritated he became. He kept trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe one of his toolboxes had shifted. Maybe a loose piece of equipment was rolling around in the truck bed. That had to be it. Still, something about the rhythm felt strange. It didn't sound random. It almost sounded deliberate. Eventually, he'd had enough. He turned the radio up to drown it out and focused on the empty highway stretching out in front of him. For a while, that worked. The music covered the noise, and he stopped thinking about it. But after several more minutes, the frustration boiled over. Without really thinking, he smacked the dashboard with the palm of his hand and muttered a few choice words at the truck. "Come on, knock it off." Oddly enough, the noise stopped. Just like that. No more thumping, no rattling, nothing. For the next 10 minutes, the truck was completely quiet. At first, he was relieved. Finally, whatever had been making that annoying sound must have settled down. But as the miles passed, another thought slowly crept into his mind. It didn't make any sense. Why would the noise stop immediately after he'd yelled? If it had been a loose tool or some mechanical issue, it should have kept making noise whenever the truck hit bumps in the road. Instead, it stopped almost as if something had hurt him. He tried to brush the thought aside. It sounded ridiculous. He was tired. His imagination was probably getting the better of him. Then, without any warning, crack. The explosion of sound behind him was so violent that his entire body jumped. It wasn't a little tap anymore. It sounded like someone had taken a heavy object and slammed it into glass with everything they had. Robert instinctively looked into the rearview mirror. What he saw nearly sent the truck off the road. There was a man standing in the truck bed, a full-grown man. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and even in the dim light from passing vehicles, Robert could clearly see him. The stranger wasn't trying to hide. He was swinging one of Robert's own tools over and over into the glass divider behind the cab. Each blow echoed through the truck. Bang, bang. The man moved with wild, desperate energy. He wasn't acting like someone trying to steal tools. He looked completely out of control, like a trapped animal trying to break through a cage. For one horrifying second, Robert completely froze. Then survival instincts took over. He jerked the steering wheel, trying to throw the man off balance. The truck swerved violently across the highway. The tires screamed against the pavement. Everything happened at once. The rear end broke loose. The truck spun sideways. Robert fought desperately to regain control, gripping the steering wheel with everything he had. He was certain the truck was about to roll. Somehow, by what he still believes was pure luck, the tires caught the pavement again. The truck skidded across the lane before finally grinding to a stop halfway between the shoulder and the right lane. For a moment, everything was silent. Robert's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. His breathing was out of control. He had just avoided what should have been a catastrophic crash. But the danger wasn't over, because somewhere behind him, that man was still there. And he had no idea what the stranger planned to do next. For a few seconds, Robert just sat there gripping the steering wheel. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely feel them. The truck had finally stopped moving, but his mind was still spinning from the near crash. He should have stayed inside. He knows that now. But adrenaline has a strange way of overriding common sense. Instead of locking the doors and calling for help, he ripped off his seatbelt and threw the driver's door open. His only thought was simple. I have to see if he is still there. He sprinted around the side of the truck toward the bed. As he rounded the back corner, he caught sight of the man in the hoodie climbing out. The stranger hit the ground without hesitation and immediately took off running toward the tree line beside the highway. For a split second, Robert chased after him. Fueled by adrenaline, he closed the distance for several yards. Then reality hit. It was pitch black. There wasn't another person in sight. The highway was nearly deserted. He had no idea whether the man was armed, or whether someone else might be waiting in those woods. The burst of courage disappeared as quickly as it arrived. He stopped running, turned around, and hurried back to the truck. The only thing that mattered now was getting away. He climbed behind the wheel, pulled back onto the highway, and drove several more miles before finally finding a safe place to stop. Only then did he step outside to inspect the damage. The glass divider behind the cab looked awful. It hadn't completely shattered, but it was covered in deep cracks stretching across nearly the entire surface. One more hard strike probably would have sent glass exploding into the cab. Robert couldn't stop thinking about how close that stranger had come. If the divider had failed while he was still driving, he didn't even want to imagine what might have happened. Curious and still trying to understand what had just taken place, he climbed into the truck bed. He expected to find one of his tools lying nearby. Instead, something completely unfamiliar caught his attention. Sitting in the corner of the truck bed was a tightly wrapped black trash bag. It definitely hadn't been there before. It was small, about the size of two clenched fists. The plastic had been folded over itself several times, almost like whoever wrapped it wanted to make absolutely sure nothing inside could leak out. As he leaned closer, a terrible smell hit him. It was overwhelming. Rotten. Like spoiled meat that had been sitting in the summer heat for days. His stomach immediately turned. He had no idea what was inside, and he didn't want to find out. All he knew was that whatever it contained didn't belong in his truck. Holding his breath, he reached down as carefully as he could, grabbed the bundle, and tossed it as far as he could toward the trees beside the highway. He didn't inspect it, he didn't open it, he wanted nothing to do with it. The moment it left his hands, he climbed out of the truck bed and got back behind the wheel. As he pulled away, he glanced down at his hands. His fingers were stained red. The outside of the bag had been coated with some kind of thick red substance, and now it had smeared across his skin. A wave of nausea washed over him. He rubbed his hands against his jeans over and over, trying to wipe it away, but the image stayed burned into his mind. He didn't know if it was blood. He didn't know what had been inside that bag, and honestly, he didn't want to know. All he wanted was to make it home. But even after the highway disappeared behind him, the questions followed him. Who was that man? Why had he hidden in the bed of the truck? And what exactly had Robert just thrown into the woods? The answers would never come, but the memory would never leave him. By the time Robert finally pulled into his driveway, the adrenaline had worn off. What replaced it was something much worse. Shock, the kind that leaves you sitting in your vehicle long after you've turned the engine off, trying to convince yourself that what just happened was actually real. He replayed every moment of the drive in his head, the gas station, the nap, the strange thumping, the violent banging on the glass, the truck spinning across the highway, the man disappearing into the trees, and finally that tightly wrapped trash bag covered in something red. The more he thought about it, the more one explanation began to make sense. The man must have climbed into the bed of his truck while he was asleep at the gas station. Because his truck didn't have a bed cover, it would have been surprisingly easy for someone to slip inside without being noticed. The stranger must have stayed completely flat the entire time Robert was driving. Otherwise, there was no way he wouldn't have seen him in the mirrors. That realization was almost more disturbing than the attack itself. For nearly 20 miles, there had been another person riding in his truck, only a few feet behind him, watching, waiting. Robert never called the police. Looking back, even he admits that probably wasn't the smartest decision. But after everything that had happened, all he wanted was to forget the entire night. He didn't want to answer endless questions. He didn't want investigators searching his truck. Most of all, he didn't want to find out what had been inside that trash bag. A few days later, one of his friends replaced the cracked glass divider without asking too many questions. Life slowly returned to normal. At least on the surface. Inside, though, things had changed. For weeks afterward, he couldn't stop looking into his mirrors. Every unexpected noise coming from his truck immediately put him on edge. Even something as harmless as a toolbox shifting during a turn would make his heart race. He found himself checking the truck bed before every drive, even in broad daylight. It became a habit he couldn't break. Because once you've experienced something like that, your brain never completely lets it go. To this day, he still has no idea who that man was. He doesn't know why he hid in the truck. He doesn't know why he suddenly became violent. And he has absolutely no idea what was inside that foul-smelling bag, or why it was coated in a mysterious red substance. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there wasn't. Either way, he has no interest in ever finding out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, because sometimes the truth is far more terrifying than anything your imagination could ever create. Whether it was a violent criminal trying to escape, someone transporting something they desperately didn't want discovered, or something even darker. Robert will never know. And honestly, that is probably for the best. If there is one thing all three of these stories have in common, it is this. A gas station seems like one of the safest places you can stop late at night. Bright lights, open businesses, and the feeling that help is always nearby can create a false sense of security. But as David and Robert learned, danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks calmly through the front door, sometimes it follows you home, and sometimes it has been riding with you for miles before you even realize it is there. So the next time you stop at a lonely gas station after midnight, take a second look around. You never know who or what might be watching.